Here today. We're going to get underway. Thank you for joining us from across the country. We're very excited to have many participants here from BC all the way to Atlantic Canada, and we're excited to provide an insightful and interesting conversation about public affairs and the legal landscape in Canada throughout COVID-19. My name is Taleesha Thorogood. I work at Fasken in their government relations and strategy practice, and am also a member of Paac Alberta and get to serve as their president. If you have any questions throughout the event, you can enter them into the question and answer function. If that doesn't work on your end, you can also put them into the chat function, and we will try to get to as many as we can at the end of the event today. We also received a couple in advance, so we will address those as well. We have a great panel today, and we are excited to have professionals that are well-versed in what's happening in Canada today, and we are looking forward to a really engaging discussion. At the top of the chat function, I've also put both the Paac website as well as my email, so if you have any questions following the event, please feel free to reach out. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Kelly to start us off. Thanks.
Thanks, Taleesha. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Harris. I'm the principal at Harris Public Affairs, and I'm the membership chair for Paac Ontario. And when I'm not doing that, I'm a columnist for a couple different publications: Queen's Park Briefing, Niagara Independent, and iPolitics. And just a little background: I've been working in public affairs, financial services sector for about the past 8 years or so. And prior to that, I did a run through a couple different legislatures, the BC legislature with many of the people I'm sure are on today, and Kim, of course, and Ontario, working for Tim Hudak in the opposition leader's office. And aside from that, I'm a trained journalist. I'm a nationally recognized journalist across Canada, award-winning, long before I discovered politics and crossed to the dark side, as they will say. And really looking forward to this, and I hope as we get going, I hope everybody's staying safe and being positive out there.
Great, thanks, Kelly. And Kim?
Hi, Kim Haakstad. I am the Vice President and General Manager of Global Public Affairs BC offices. And I am also President of the Paac chapter in British Columbia. I spent many years, like Kelly, working in government and politics, both federally in politics and provincially in politics and government. I've also spent time running an industry association, and these days I lobby federally, provincially, and municipally. So hopefully I can bring some valuable insights to the conversation today, and thanks everyone for joining.
Great, and finally, Milos.
Thank you, Taleesha. Milos Barutciski. I'm a partner at Borden, Ladner, Gervais International Trade and Investment Practice. Unlike Kelly and Kim, I don't lobby. I think in 30 years I've registered twice or maybe 3 times, though I deal with, my practice covers a broad range of regulatory matters, cross-border primarily investigations. So I deal with government on an ongoing basis, usually covered by the legal application of law exemptions, so that doesn't require me to register. But on the other hand, working with consultants and public affairs professionals and others who have to register in other contexts, we spend a lot of time, my colleagues and I, on lobbyist registration and public policy matters. So there you have it.
Great, thanks guys for your introductions. So we're going to dive right into questions here. Our first question all of our panelists are going to answer as kind of an introductory start to our conversation today. How is the COVID-19 situation likely to change the legal and regulatory landscape in which public affairs professionals operate today? And we'll start with Kelly on that one.
You know, this is interesting. I've given this a lot of thought over the last couple of days. We talked about it, and one of the things that came to question is legal and regulatory. I'm sure Kim is going to talk about the lobbyist registry out in BC, and I started thinking about access to government officials. I mean, yeah, we can pick up the phone as we are all doing right now, but I remember in 2018, as we've had major events happen over the last 20 years, 2001, we've had the shootings on Parliament Hill and such like that. and these terrible incidents, and we've seen the actual job of doing our job change. And I wonder whether or not the amount of people going through the legislatures, the House of Commons and the various buildings, whether or not changes are going to have to be put into place for that. And I started really thinking overnight about roles that Paac can play, Public Affairs Association of Canada can play with all of the members that are online here and all of the potential members out there, to show some leadership to working with the different governments to try and make the workplaces safer as we access them. And I know this isn't regulatory change and the kind of things that we want to talk about as with our clients and stuff, but this, I think, is a major change to the actual function of our job.
Oh, that's really helpful, Kelly. And with that, I think there's going to be, major changes as we go through this time and following it. Kim, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, maybe I'll take a moment, as Kelly mentioned, and address BC specifically. So in BC, many people may know, especially those on the call from British Columbia, our new Lobbyist Transparency Act came into force as of Monday, May 4th. And so we're in the process of regulatory change in this time period, and folks are logging on to the new registry system for the first time, tracking their communications with government in a new way, somewhat similar to the federal system, but with some unique made in BC approaches, as is so often out here in the West. And most importantly, for anyone on the call who is a in-house lobbyist that was previously from time to time lobbying in British Columbia and not meeting the 100-hour threshold, that's actually been eliminated. And so if you lobby really once in British Columbia with very limited exceptions, you now need to register. So it's worth familiarizing yourself with the system, and not just because of the BC changes and interacting here, but also because we are quite certain that the registrars and commissioners across the country are looking at what's happening in BC and governments as well. And with a lot of lobbying going on right now, there is potential for BC's changes to roll across the country, as we often see with public policy.
Absolutely, and those compliance pieces are super important as we move forward in this time. Milos, do you have anything to add from kind of the legal part from your role at BLG?
Well, let me start with pick up on something Kim just mentioned a moment ago. Right now, governments are out actively soliciting input on policy making on an urgent basis, and companies are, a couple of weeks ago, it was rushing to get the government to see if you were essential, and if you weren't, you thought you should be, essentially lobbying the government to be essential, to be added to the list, and so forth. Now, in most large companies have in-house professional public affairs people who know all about that and who track the time and so forth. A lot of smaller and mid-sized businesses don't, and until just the past few weeks, have really not devoted sufficient time to register or to be required to register, and they have been lobbying. Now you can chew up, when you got a 50-hour rule in some jurisdictions and in some places that includes preparation time, you're going to chew that 50 hours up very, very quickly. You'll chew it up in the space of a week. So that's one thing that I think people need to pay attention to right now, not just post-pandemic. The other thing, again, I think picking up on something Kim alluded to right at the end of her comment, is what BC has done by expanding the rules, I think is going to be picked up elsewhere. Quebec already has a very broad lobbyist registration law that requires registration by many companies that that don't have to register federally or in other jurisdictions. I think you can see a trend already in that direction. Alberta didn't even have a law until 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I can't remember when it was exactly, and it was very weak, but it has been strengthened since. And so that's where I think we're going to be heading. How does that change the broader environment of how we interact? Well, Kelly, you noted the physical issue. That almost goes back to, I'm thinking, the mid-2000s when the Oklahoma bombing occurred. I happened to be in Washington negotiating a treaty, and the next morning I showed up at the Justice Department and had to go through, previously you could just walk in, now we had to go through metal detectors the next morning. That's already, that physical distancing of our representatives and government officials has already happened to some extent. There will be a tightening, but I'm confident that with everything that's been put in place in the past few weeks, officials and elected officials as well are going to remain accessible.
One of the things I was also thinking about this, if you think back I think back to Ontario, the week that everything happened, the weekend before was the mining conference going on in Toronto, and it was a massive, massive mining conference. 2 days later, Minister Phillips, the finance minister for Ontario, gave his pre-budget speech, and later that night was the Public Affairs Association reception at Queen's Park. The next day, we found out that somebody at the mining conference had tested positive for COVID-19. And it's more, what I mean is more the personal safety and health considerations for people who are interacting, because we interact in huge groups. Lobby, if you think about it, we go to a ton of conferences and we're always around people, we're always shaking hands, and that's part of our job. And it really, I was actually thinking about when I spoke at a conference in Singapore a couple of years ago, and when we landed in Singapore, we had to go through this long aisle in the airport, and they were taking our temperatures in the aisle. And there were a couple of people on the flight who had elevated temperatures, and they got pulled right out and sent in for testing before they were even allowed to enter the country. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be like that trying to get into the buildings, but these are considerations, I think, that are going to impact our business and the health and safety of government workers, but also our own health and safety.
For sure, yeah, there's definitely going to be significant changes as we move along. So moving into another question that has to do more with the government relations side of things as we move forward. So during this time in crisis, what would you say is the most important thing to consider as whether you're an in-house lobbyist or consultant lobbyist? What do you think is most important to consider when advancing your interests as an organization? We'll start with Kim on that question.
Sure. I think maybe it's quite obvious, but right now, one of the things you want to think about is whoever you're approaching in government, what is their role in either response or preparing for recovery, and making sure that we're providing maybe a little bit more lead time than we usually do when asking for meetings or reaching out to folks, to make sure that you're being really sensitive to the additional pressures they have on them. I know we've had conversations with senior public servants who are incredibly seasoned, well-respected leaders in their fields, who have actually just said, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought of that, right? And they just haven't had time. So really, I think it's worth taking that into consideration, spending a bit more time on your pre-preparation for your government engagements and making sure that you're being sensitive to the additional, taxing pieces of their work that are available. And there's a number of folks who aren't really involved in the response. And so you can also reach out to those folks and see if there's something that they can do to help you. So it's a bit issue by issue, because it really depends on who your targets are at the political level or at the public service level. Obviously, some are much more involved in response and recovery than others. But really spending that time, if you have an in-house team or some consultants really thinking that through a bit more than we usually do, where government's generally accessible to stakeholders.
For sure, yeah, and I think it's all about ensuring that you're not that you're going to the people maybe who aren't dealing with the response. If your issue is not to do with the response, then move it towards someone who may be dealing with other issues during this time. Kelly, do you have any other additional insights on that?
Well, I would say in being even more cognizant of the time you're taking with people right now, because and as Kim mentioned, the emotional side of things here and the mental health side of things. So my time in BC, I was part of the provincial emergency program, and we did all the training on crisis management and crisis response training. And one of the things they walked through was just the understanding the heightened level of anxiety and stress that people are under in these circumstances. So you don't know what's going on in these people's lives. You don't know what's going on at home. You don't know if their parents are in a long-term care facility that's under threat. You don't know if their spouses are working or not. You don't know these things. So just be extra human to them, I guess, is the best way to put it. I mean, we're not jerks. As a rule, we try to treat everybody really well and be good people, but just going that extra little mile I think is going to prove incredibly valuable in the long term.
Absolutely, yeah. So the next question that I have is around the challenges that you face, because I'm sure everyone that's on our webinar today has, obviously there's been extreme changes with how we operate in our roles, but also there's extreme challenges with working from home in our environments. So starting with Milos on this one, what have you viewed as the most significant challenge during this time and how you've managed to navigate it? I think you're just muted there, Milos.
Sorry about that. What's been interesting is that it's had less impact on our ability to deliver services efficiently than I and many others anticipated. I mean, many of us have already been either communicating with clients, regulators, and each other electronically for years, so we're kind of adapted to it. Where there's been more challenge is dealing with internal administrative processes, and not just within the advisors, law firms, public affairs, but on the business end as well. So when you're talking with a client, the general counsel, or whoever you're dealing with, 3 months ago, they would have just stood up, walked to the next office, or gone to their assistant station, or reached out into a cabinet and picked something up or pulled out something. That doesn't happen as efficiently and easily as it used to. Both internal, so it's the internal processes that have been affected, I think, more acutely than the client advisor relationships or advisor client regulator advisor regulator relationships. Those communications are taking place. The bigger impact or another big impact in our area, at least, has been in the shifting priorities and uncertainties with regulators and government departments. Not surprisingly, a lot of routine stuff has been put on hold or deferred entirely. Deadlines, I mean, just simple things like renewing your, license plate sticker in Ontario. Forget it, don't bother. And the same thing applies with many internal regulatory processes. Some regulators have said, we're not doing audits, verifications, etc., for the foreseeable future. We will get back to it, so don't forget about compliance, but it's not going to be happening in the regular process now. Same thing with deadlines. Or basically application processes and other regulatory processes. There are delays. Delays have been around for now weeks or months now, we're reaching, and they're not going to get any better for the foreseeable future. There are exceptions where there's statutory time limits. Even those have been, in some instances, waived through amendments and other regulatory maneuvers. So I think those are the biggest impacts we're facing now. The internal ones, dealing with our own colleagues and our own internal process, that will come up over time. And that will change, and that will get more efficient over time. And on the regulatory side, with the delays as government tries to adapt, again, I think it will change over time, but hopefully by the time they have to change, where it becomes basically excruciatingly urgent, we will have started to open up sufficiently so that we can go back to some of what we used to do before. Not all, but some.
Definitely, yeah, and I think it's interesting seeing from a law firm perspective what the challenges are versus what might be going on for those who are strictly in kind of the consultant, or for people like Kelly who have their own business. Kelly, what have you kind of seen as a significant challenge on your end?
Well, it's interesting because I have a group of clients that I service through. I'm dealing with virtually on a regular basis, and we're doing virtual meetings and such like that. And I'm also working directly for a client as an essential service, a financial institution. So I'm actually, in fact, I'm in the office at the financial institution right now. So I'm getting both sides of this, and in both areas, you're short staff. I mean, because there's very few people around. Everything's over the phone. We are naturally extroverted people as government relations people, and the inability to be around our colleagues, the inability to, even after work, going for a beer with a group of government people just to talk about what's going on, that it really does take a lot out of our ability to do our job. And I've been trying to pick up the phone and call people a lot more right now, and not even for work stuff, just friends of mine that are involved in the industry, just to check in on them and talk to them. And I'm finding that keeping the and I'm an extrovert, and this is really hard on extroverts. I'm sure if anybody who's watching this who is an extrovert understands that it's really hard on extroverts, because we want to get out and we want to talk to people, and we can't do that. And just as something that has come out of all these Zoom meetings, ending a Zoom meeting is probably the most uncomfortable thing in the entire world. Like, how do you end these meetings and not look completely unprofessional and goofy?
Definitely. Yeah, it definitely changes both with colleagues and those that you have relationships with. The world of going and grabbing a quick coffee or a beer is over for the time being, and that's definitely a challenge. Milos, given your legal background, what would you say, and I'd love to hear your perspective on how you believe that the pandemic has affected Canadian the supply chain and on the international level and on the trade level as well?
You're on mute, Milos.
Yeah, I'm off now. The first and biggest hit, obviously, was in connection with China. Between factory shutdowns, travel restrictions, inventory was being gradually, actually quickly run down in a just-in-time environment. It doesn't take very long. Shipments, especially higher tech product that come by air as opposed to commodities. The supply chains were being affected, and not just products from China, even more locally produced or regionally produced products, as your suppliers or our client suppliers stopped getting delivery of essential products from China. And not just China, it expanded further. Then even Europe, and so far you saw shutdowns in many, many other places. So clearly, that's been probably the biggest impact, expanding over time. So companies were forced to look to new suppliers and alternative sources, some locally, some abroad, because it was just inconceivable or impossible for a host of reasons to source locally. So that may be a simple process. Well, it's never a simple process. As once you get into technology, once you get into regulated products, there are qualifications you need to meet, specifications you need to meet, regulatory approvals you need to meet, and all of that takes time. And that the pandemic, now, that's sort of what the impact right away. But the pandemic wasn't the only thing that's affected supply chains in the past few months. I mean, even before the pandemic really started impacting beyond China, sometime in January, I guess, we'd already faced the trade frictions between the United States and China. And those were having impacts, broader impacts, not just as between bilateral United States and China. They were having impacts on third countries as the US started imposing punitive tariffs and export control restrictions on technology, and given the Chinese role in there, it was starting to have downstream impacts on many clients and many sectors. Again, that's probably more acute in the technology sector, but not only. So what have companies done? Well, one thing they've done is turn to government in various instances, greater use of the Trade Commissioner Service at Global Affairs, use of Export Development Corporation, not just to tap supply chains, but also to tap markets as the environment changed rapidly in the months before the pandemic, and then even more rapidly since. And you know what? These departments have been there, though they face their own challenges. But this whole supply chain issue predates even the pandemic. We've been facing rapid and significant evolution there for months now, or years even.
Sure, yeah, no, thanks, Milos. I want to move into a really practical question to help participants navigate this time and as we move forward. So for both Kelly and Kim, and we'll start with Kelly, if an organization solely has interests that are unrelated to COVID-19, should they move those asks off the table until further notice? Or how is the best way to spend their time and efforts in this time?
Quite honestly, I think that any organization that comes to a dead stop is going to have a hard time restarting when we get through this. We might actually be up and functioning as soon as the next 6 weeks in most jurisdictions in Canada. And if you aren't keeping the momentum of we all know what it's like when we have an election and we have to restart our ass after the election ends, and we have to start from scratch. And it's incredible waste of money. It's an incredible waste of good work being done. The momentum is key, and you need to do it. You need to continue it. You need to understand that your ask is not going to be a top priority for anybody right now, unless they find a way to make it a political thing, which we're not going to get into the number of political things that have happened recently. But I would strongly urge and say to clients, don't stop just because it's COVID-19, because we will find a way to get through this, and your ask is still going to have value. And if you want to start over again, you just wasted a lot of money to get to whatever point you had that ask at in the first place.
Definitely. And I think it all ties back to that being sensitive, right? That you mentioned in your previous answer. And definitely. Kim, what's your perspective, especially being in a different jurisdiction and dealing with a different environment?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is it kind of depends, right? There is a whole of government approach, I think, across the country and each level of government that is looking at response and now really shifting to recovery. And I think in recovery, even if you haven't had a direct COVID-19 essential service kind of impact or a business closure, you've probably seen an alteration of how you're operating, whether that's a slowdown in business because people just aren't out and about, or that spending patterns have changed, other things. So, you know, many people have impacts, many sectors have impacts. You know, donations have dried up to public sector or private charities, those kinds of things. So most things probably do have an angle of COVID, and in recovery, there's an opportunity to have those conversations with government. I would caution, though, that government's going to see through asks that you've had on the table for a very long time being revisited with a COVID angle. So I would caution people to be really careful about how you build that in. If you're going to ask for something that you've been asking for 6 years, and government has had lots of reasons why they're not prepared to move forward, and in some cases governments of different political stripes may have come about in those times, you know, government will see through it. So make sure that you're really thoughtful working through that with your team, and being careful about those asks. You know, too cute by half will be caught, and you may harm your ability to actually move forward your most important priorities that government's willing to work with you on.
And to follow up with that, Kim, shoehorning your issue into COVID-19, yeah, these guys are smart enough. They'll figure it out real quick. So don't try that.
We're seeing it, though.
I'm sure we are. I know we are.
Yeah.
Definitely. So as a final question before we move into question and answer period, for all of our panelists, and we'll start with Kim on this one, do you believe that the legal and regulatory landscape has been altered permanently or temporarily in this time? I think that's what a lot of people are asking, is how is this going to shift and how is this going to change things in the interim, but also in the long term?
Yeah, I think there's a couple points on that. I mean, obviously we mentioned this already, but I will say it again. Watch what BC's done. Look for what that might mean in your jurisdiction as you're engaging with your ministers responsible for lobbyist registration and the political priorities of your government. We also in BC have a push from a number of different municipalities to build municipal registration systems. There's a potential that gets taken more seriously after this. And then I think the other piece is we've seen rapid policy development and and sometimes permanent, sometimes temporary regulatory change in this time. You know, government is going to feel pressured by all of our sectors that they should be able to move more quickly in a recovery period in particular to help make sure that things are working. It'll be, you know, time will sort of tell on what we're going to see from government in responding to that, if things will slow down back to normal, or if we'll find another new normal on how long it takes to work some processes through the system. So, you know, I think that there's a lot to be seen, but those are some of the things that I'm watching for.
Definitely. Milos, from your perspective, kind of in the legal landscape, what are your thoughts?
Well, there's been legal and regulatory environment has been slow to adapt to technology. Some provinces and some provincial courts have done much better than others, and same thing with regulators. There's also a tendency to adapt bespoke systems. Each department will do its own thing. We're dealing with one regulator in the trade sector that will only distribute confidential documents on disks. You know, a lot of computers don't even have disk drives anymore, and you have to submit to them on disks. Well, okay. Stuff like that is going to start, there's going to be pressure to catch up. Ontario's courts have probably been the most notorious in the delays in getting up and running and more digital. So they're forced to do that now. Even the Chief Justice has made comments about it, and it's heading that way. The other part of it, and that's going to be across government. I mean, many government departments, many governments have already made progress, a great deal of progress towards digitizing. Having said that, the past little while, especially on the regulatory front, getting guidance from government has become more difficult. And the digital interaction, when everything is forced into a digital interaction, isn't necessarily as effective or as efficient as live voice interaction. So that's where professionals like yourselves come in, where legal counsel comes in, who can navigate the system, who understand the system very well, and in-house professionals as well. The sector where I see it being more challenging is for the day-to-day consumer and citizen. The average person doesn't necessarily have the time or the bandwidth or the expertise to titrate between the different types of programs, the different types of accesses. We've seen some of that in the CERB and student and the various kinds of supports. People are saying, well, what do I qualify for? Do I qualify for this? Do I qualify for that? And it's very difficult to get a live voice at the other end. If you're a professional and have networks and access already, it's one thing. If you're the average citizen who doesn't deal with or interact with government except for the occasional visit to Service Ontario, then it becomes a bit more challenging. So I can see changes in both directions. Much has already been digitized and will be even more further digitized. Other things we may have to see an effort to try and revive or make personal interactions a little better and a little more efficient, a little bit more manageable.
For sure, yeah. And Kelly, just some wrap-up comments from you on that question, then we'll move into a Q&A period.
Well, one of the things that so coming from the financial world, I look back to the subprime mortgage crisis in 08-09. And if you take a look at how Canada fared versus our southern neighbors and that, Canada was in pretty good shape because we didn't deregulate our financial institutions to even remotely the same degree that the US did. And what ended up happening is because the US couldn't get it together in the subprime mortgage crisis, Canadian financial institutions have been dealing with intense regulatory changes over the years. All over the world this has happened. And what I'm saying here is, with considering the way the US has been responding to COVID-19, I do think we're going to see a lot of changes and pressures to change in many different areas that we don't even know, we can't even anticipate yet, because we are so tied into US. They're our #1 trading partner. You know, the food supply chain, other supply chains are tied into that. And quite honestly, if you take a look, like Premier Ford saying to Donald Trump where to go when he didn't want to send masks from 3M to Ontario anymore. Those types of things, we don't even know the impacts that are going to be on Canadian regulatory and legislative landscape, because quite honestly, I don't think US is close enough to figuring out yet.
Definitely. It's definitely going to provide some interesting times in our worlds, and especially in the public affairs sector. So moving into a question and answer period, and a reminder, if you guys have any questions, feel free to enter them in the Q&A format. We'll provide brief responses to these, and you can always send me an email. Again, it's at the top of the chat function, and we can provide more thorough responses after if necessary. So the first question we have, and we received a couple in advance as well. The first one we received here on the chat function is, here in BC, many local government regional conferences in the spring were canceled. Do you anticipate UBCM, which is scheduled in September, will be canceled as well? And what would you recommend on how to engage with local government officials in alternative ways? So we'll start with Kim on that one, as she's based out in BC.
Sure. I'll start just, UBCM is the Union of BC Municipalities. I think these organizations are called something different in each province, but it's our municipal government conference. And I don't think we know yet whether or not that will proceed. I think everyone's waiting to see what the fall looks like. One conversation we're having actively in our company today was what's happening with university openings in the spring as well, whether some of the, or fall, whether those will be online or otherwise. And BC in about 90 minutes will announce their reopening plan, which might mean I have more answers. But one of the things that we're working on just with some of our clients at Global Public Affairs is virtual lobby days. So instead of doing the series of meetings face-to-face, actually putting together virtual engagement sessions where we're engaging with MLAs and public servants in the same environment as we're using today. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over time and how receptive governments are to that. But I think everybody's getting really used to this format, and hopefully it can be effective ways to engage at any level of government.
Definitely.
Sorry, figured you were going to me next anyways, Taleesha.
I was.
So FCM, which is the Federation of Canadian Municipalities meeting, was supposed to be in Toronto in June. It's been canceled. I'm pretty sure AMO, which is the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, for August has been canceled. I would be shocked if UBCM went off in September. It might be pushed back a little while. That's just my guess from my background in BC and such. One of the strategies I've been trying to build and reaching out to the different organizations is, how do my clients' products benefit what areas? And it's easier with finance because finance benefits everybody, I guess, or backward the other way too. But basically reaching out to them and saying, because there's still trade associations, and many trade associations are on the line, and your responsibility is to provide services for your members and provide information for your members. In a lot of areas, that's going to involve the clients that we are all representing. So how do you get in? One of the strategies I've taken is, how do I get to whatever the trade associations like an AMO or an FCM is doing, so that my clients are on a kind of a panel like this and giving their expertise virtually where they can't do it in person. And that's been one of the strategies I've been trying to take and suggesting to the different organizations. And they seem somewhat receptive. It's you're kind of reinventing the wheel, but they seem somewhat receptive.
Definitely, it's a change in time and how we do things. Overall, it has definitely transitioned for everyone. So one question we received in advance of the panel was, as we think about the legacy of COVID-19, what can we anticipate about the jurisdictional fight that may play out between the federal and provincial governments over long-term care? We're obviously seeing this as being a front and center issue, and so I think this is a really good question we received from a participant earlier. So we'll start with Kim on this one.
Sure. I mean, I think we've seen, maybe just starting not specifically to long-term care, but as governments across Canada have turned conservative, the relationship between Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Horgan in BC has gotten stronger and stronger. So certainly watch for BC and Ottawa to be working closer together than ever. On long-term care specifically, I'll say that I don't totally have a sense of how the federal government is going to respond. Obviously, it's an area of provincial jurisdiction, but they're feeling pressure to respond. But, you know, in a province like British Columbia, we have Minister Adrian Dix as our health minister. He has long been he's got a union background in healthcare. He has long had a view that as many services as possible in healthcare should be provided by the public sector. And I think, you know, they've already started reviewing what policy changes they might make in the long-term care sector here in BC, and seeing a level of bringing back into the public sector of those services, I think would not surprise anyone. There's lots of reasons why it works in the private sector, and I think we've seen that some of the private sector companies have responded very, very well to the long-term care situation that we've faced. But it's a hard one to predict, but in BC, I wouldn't be surprised to see us leading the charge on bringing forward opportunities to have the government more involved in the sector. Leading might not everyone agree with that. I mean, first, not necessarily that that's the way that folks want it to go.
No, and that's an interesting perspective, and I think there's definitely going to be changes to how we do things across the board. And Kelly, what did you have to add to that?
Really, really quickly, this has been something that I've been annoyed about for quite some time, and it's not COVID-19 necessarily related. It's the fact that we don't do enough to support long-term care homes, public or private, and to ensure that their staff don't have to go between different homes, spreading things. The common flu, every year the flu kills tons of Canadians because in long-term care facilities, because it's being spread from care facility to care facility. And I think the extra focus on that, we're going to actually see governments stepping up and making some changes in there and finding ways to support long-term care homes to be able to have staff not having to go in between care homes.
Yeah,
or I hope so anyway.
Yeah, I think we're all hoping that there's going to be changes in that world for sure. So moving on to another question, I think we'll have time for one more here, and we will take the remaining questions and ensure that I distribute them and we get you answers following the event. So moving into one more from the Q&A section here is, where do you see opportunities arising from the COVID situation from a government relations and public relations perspective? I think we can start with Kelly on that.
I think that right now we've now moved into the reopening of the economy, and I think where your opportunities come from is what can I do in my business to promote a safe, effective reopening of the economy, and how do I I say this is a general rule for whenever I do government relations or anything I do. If you're giving the government solutions to their problems and solutions to your problem at the same time, you've got a way better chance of being successful. So if you're looking for opportunities in this, what is the government trying to do? How can you help them do that? And that's your opportunity.
That's, yeah, certainly. And Kim, from your perspective, what do you think might change, and where do you see opportunities arising following the crisis?
Well, I mean, I put the caution on it that I did earlier to make sure that we don't see it as an opportunity to bring everything forward that we've wanted for a very long time. But I do think that there is some opportunities for governments to look at things in a different light. If there's processes that they've brought about change on that have worked really well in this time period, is there a way to extend those? One of them in BC that I think many people are watching carefully is, does our insurance corporation, which is government owned, actually allow long-term online renewal solutions instead of us having to go into a physical office? And where are some of those other things where actually the technology solutions work? And I saw another question on here too that mentioned, well, what about communities and individuals who don't have adequate access to online tools or the ability to use them? And I think we will see governments look for ways to keep old systems while they transition to new ones. I think that we will still see, as soon as we can start moving around the province again, governments favoring first face-to-face engagements with people wherever possible. I don't think that will change in the long term. Politicians, good ones anyways, recognize that when you get outside of the capital city bubble, that's where you really understand what's happening. You get back in touch with your constituents or other people in the province as a cabinet minister. And so I think that stuff will come back, but there may be some more modern solutions. We have a healthcare approval process in British Columbia that's still done by fax machine. It absolutely astounds me that we think that that's okay, especially when most people don't have that technology, like Milos said on the example of discs. So, I think we'll see some advancement, but we will, I think, see most governments ensure that there's an option for people who don't have access to proper high-speed broadband or the technology or ability to utilize technology.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that even with the education side, as a lot of governments have started to provide to help in the virtual space to continue the education for those who may not have access to the technology necessary to do so. So we want to keep everything on time here. And so we said 45 minutes, so we're going to stick to that. But we did receive a few more questions, so we'll ensure that those get answered and distributed, and we'll get answers to you guys following. So thank you to our panelists here. It was fantastic, and for the insightful and just contributing to this thoughtful discussion. And to all of our participants, thank you for being here. And I know it's a busy time for those in public affairs and across the board in different industries. So as we continue to navigate COVID-19, I hope that you all stay safe and healthy. And if you are not a Paac member and you wish to do so, again, the website is at the top of the chat function. It's publicaffairs.ca, and feel free to reach out with any questions. My email is there as well, and we'd love to be in conversation with you. So we look forward to seeing you all again soon, and we hope you remain safe and healthy throughout this time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.